The morning after my soldier husband's funeral, my in-laws changed the locks and threw my things out onto the driveway like yesterday's trash. Blood family only. Get out, they yelled, their voices cutting through the quiet Virginia morning. I stood there in my uniform, still carrying the folded flag from Arlington in my arms, and looked them dead in the eye. "You forgot one thing," I said calmly. "I'm carrying his child. And the $1.2 million insurance policy is in my name. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Elena Hayes. I'm 38 years old, and 24 hours earlier, I had buried the only man who ever truly saw me." The rain at Arlington had been relentless, soaking through my dress uniform as the honor guard performed the final salute. The bugle notes of taps still echoed in my bones when I pulled my Jeep onto the familiar oak-lined street just before 8 that morning. The house looked peaceful from a distance, white columns, black shutters, the big magnolia tree Daniel and I had planted on our 5th anniversary. But something was wrong. The front door stood slightly ajar, and I could hear voices inside. Loud, unfamiliar. I parked at the curb instead of the driveway. My hand went automatically to my pocket for the house key's muscle memory from 9 years of coming home. The key slid in, but refused to turn. I tried again, harder. Nothing. A cold knot formed low in my stomach, the same feeling I used to get before a night operation in Afghanistan. I pressed the doorbell. The cheerful chimes sounded obscene in the heavy silence that followed. The door finally opened. My brother-in-law Derek stood there in a faded polo shirt, a half-eaten protein bar in one hand, looking annoyed, rather than grief-stricken. Behind him, I saw the chaos. Movers in gray uniforms were carrying out my grandmother's old oak rocking chair, the one that still smelled faintly of her lavender sachets. My father-in-law, Colonel Richard Whitaker, retired, stood in the center of the living room like he was directing troop movements, clipboard in hand. Cigar smoke curling around his silver hair. "Elena," he said flatly, not even bothering with condolences. "You're back sooner than expected." Margaret, my mother-in-law, descended the staircase holding my jewelry box, the small walnut one Daniel had bought me in Germany. She opened it, peered inside with that familiar expression of mild distaste, then set it on a side table as if it were contaminated. "We're doing what's best for the family, dear," she said, her Virginia drawl thick with false sweetness. "Blood has to come first. Daniel would understand." I stepped inside anyway, my combat boots leaving damp prints on the hardwood floor we had refinished together. The air smelled of cigar smoke, fresh coffee, and something sharper tension. Boxes were stacked everywhere. My clothes, my books on military history, even the framed photos of Daniel and me from our deployments. One mover was carefully removing my Bronze Star citation from the wall where it had hung beside Daniel's. I didn't raise my voice. Years of command had taught me that silence could be heavier than shouting. I simply stood there absorbing every detail, the way Richard avoided my eyes, the nervous twitch in Derek's jaw, Margaret's tight-lipped smile that never reached her eyes. They had planned this. While I was still at the cemetery accepting condolences from Daniel's fellow officers, they had already changed the locks and called the movers. "You have 2 hours," Richard announced, tapping his clipboard. "Collect what's yours and go. This house belongs to the Whitakers. Always has." The words landed like artillery. 9 years of marriage reduced to what's yours. I felt our baby shift slightly inside me, a tiny reminder that not everything could be taken. But I kept my face neutral, the way I had learned to do when receiving bad intel in the field. My hand moved instinctively to rest low on my abdomen, hidden beneath the fabric of my uniform jacket. Derek muttered something about transient military types as he directed a mover toward the garage where my deployment duffels were stored. Margaret picked up our wedding portrait, slid my photo out from behind the glass with deliberate care, and dropped it into a black trash bag. "We'll keep the one of Daniel," she said lightly. "He doesn't need you in the background anymore." Something inside me tightened, but I remained still. I watched them dismantle my life piece by piece, the Afghan I had knitted during long nights waiting for Daniel's safe return. The coffee mug with our initials, the small wooden cross Daniel had carved for me after my first combat tour. Each object carried memories that these people would never understand. When the movers lifted the last visible box of my belongings and headed for the door, I finally spoke. My voice was quiet, steady, the voice of an officer who had led soldiers through worse. "You forgot one thing." Richard turned, irritation flashing across his patrician features. "And what might that be, Elena?" I looked straight into his eyes the same blue as Daniel's but without any of the warmth, and delivered the words I had carried like loaded ammunition since the night Daniel told me the plan. "I'm carrying his child. 8 weeks along. And the $1.2 million service members group life insurance policy lists me as the sole beneficiary." The clipboard slipped from Richard's fingers and clattered onto the floor. Margaret's hand flew to her throat. Derek froze mid-step, his mouth half open. For the first time that morning, the house fell into absolute silence. I stood there in the middle of the wreckage they had created, one hand still protectively over the new life growing inside me, and felt the first real breath I had taken since the bugle sounded at Arlington. It hadn't always been outright war. For 9 years it had been a cold one, silent, polite, and exhausting in its precision. Looking back now, standing in the ruins of what used to be my living room, I realized the signs had been there from the very first weekend I drove up to Virginia to meet Daniel's family. I met Captain Daniel Whitaker in the spring of 2016 at Fort Bragg. He was a signals intelligence officer with calm gray eyes and a quiet sense of humor that cut through the chaos of military life. We bonded over late-night briefings, shared deployments, and the way we both understood the weight of the uniform. 2 years later, we married in a modest chapel outside Fayetteville. His family arrived in matching navy blazers and pearls, smiling the kind of smiles that never quite reached their eyes. The first dinner at their colonial home in Northern Virginia remains burned into my memory. The house smelled of lemon polish and old money. Crystal glasses caught the chandelier light as Margaret Whitaker served shrimp and grits on heirloom china. Richard sat at the head of the table like a retired colonel still reviewing troops. "So Elena," Margaret began, her Virginia accent smooth as sweet tea, "Daniel tells us you're from Pennsylvania. Your father was a sergeant." She said the word as if it were a curious specimen under glass. "Yes, ma'am. Master Sergeant. Retired now. Worked his way up from the motor pool." Richard gave a slow nod. "Self-made men have their place. Of course the military has changed. So many different backgrounds these days." His eyes flicked over my hands, strong, calloused from years of field training, and lingered just long enough to make the point. I smiled politely and tried to steer the conversation toward Daniel's work, but they kept circling back. To my lack of Southern roots, to the fact that I had no trust fund, no debutante ball, no proper Virginia pedigree. Daniel squeezed my knee under the table, his touch warm and steady, but the damage was already done. I left that night feeling like I had failed an inspection I hadn't known I was taking. The years that followed were a masterclass in subtle exclusion. Christmas mornings where my carefully chosen gifts were set aside with faint praise, while Daniel's siblings received heirloom silver. Summer barbecues where I was introduced as Daniel's wife. She serves too, the emphasis always making my service sound like a quirky hobby, rather than a career that had taken me to 3 combat zones. Margaret once asked me, in front of 20 guests, if I planned to continue with that sort of thing after we had children. As if protecting the country was a phase I would eventually outgrow. Daniel saw it all. He never raised his voice to his parents, but he stood beside me like a quiet shield. When Richard suggested we sign a prenuptial agreement just to keep things clean, Daniel refused outright. "Elena is my family," he told his father in the study that evening, his voice low but firm. "The only one that matters." Yet the colder the family grew toward me, the more determined Daniel became to protect what we were building. Our home became our sanctuary. We planted gardens, refinished floors, and filled the walls with photos of us in uniforms side by side in Afghanistan, laughing in Germany, holding each other after a difficult homecoming. In that house, I learned what real partnership meant. Daniel never treated my rank as competition. He celebrated it. He was the one who stayed up with me after long staff meetings, rubbing my shoulders and listening as I debriefed the weight of command. Then the diagnosis came. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. The words landed like an unexpected mortar round. Daniel was only 42. In the 14 months that followed, I watched my strong, gentle husband fight with a dignity that humbled me. Chemo stole his hair and his strength, but never his resolve. During the good hours when the pain medication gave him clarity, he would hold my hand and speak of the future I refused to imagine without him. One humid evening in late summer, as fireflies danced outside the window, he pulled me close on the couch. "Elena, if the worst happens, they will come for everything. The house, the accounts. Even the clinic grandfather left me. They've been planning it for years." I tried to protest, but he shook his head. "I've known for a long time. That's why I've been working with Thomas Blackwell. Everything is already in motion. Joint tenancy right of survivorship, updated beneficiary forms. The moment I'm gone, it becomes yours. Automatically. No probate. No arguments." Tears slipped down my cheeks. Daniel brushed them away with a trembling thumb. "There's more, love." His hand moved gently to my stomach. "You're pregnant. 8 weeks. I had the doctor run the test privately during my last appointment. I didn't want them to know. Not yet." The world tilted. Joy and grief crashed together inside my chest. I was going to be a mother, but the father of my child was slipping away. Daniel pulled me into his arms, his voice hoarse but certain. "This baby is our victory. And I've made sure my family can never take that from you either." He wrote the letter that night. Not a legal document, but something far more powerful, a final message from a husband who had watched his wife endure years of quiet disrespect. Thomas had instructions: read it only if they made any hostile move. Daniel looked at me with eyes that still held the fire of the officer I had fallen in love with. "I'm leaving you a war, Elena, but I'm also leaving you every weapon you'll need to win it." In the months that followed, I held his hand through endless nights in the hospital, through the final goodbye at Arlington, and through the long drive home that ended with changed locks and moving boxes. Now, standing in the wreckage they had created, I understood the depth of his love. Every subtle slight, every condescending remark, every attempt to diminish me had only strengthened his determination to protect me. The Whitakers had spent 9 years treating me like a temporary guest in their son's life. They were about to discover just how permanent I had become. The days after the diagnosis blurred into a relentless rhythm of hospital corridors, sterile rooms, and whispered conversations held in the small hours of the night. Daniel fought the cancer with the same quiet determination he had once brought to classified missions. But even as his body weakened, his mind grew sharper, more focused on the battle that would come after he was gone. I remember one particular evening in mid-August, the air thick with humidity and the scent of gardenias drifting through the open window. Daniel had just finished another round of chemotherapy that left him pale and exhausted, but his eyes still held that familiar intensity. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we had shared countless quiet dinners, and he placed a worn leather briefcase between us. The brass latches clicked open with a sound that felt final. "Elena," he said, his voice low and steady despite the rasp of illness, "I need you to listen carefully. My family has never accepted you. Not really. And when I'm gone, they will try to erase you from this life we built together." I wanted to argue, to tell him they wouldn't dare, but we both knew better. I had seen the way Richard looked at me during holidays, the calculating glances Margaret exchanged with her friends at the country club. Daniel reached across the table and took my hands. His grip was weaker than it used to be, but the warmth was still there. "I've been meeting with Thomas Blackwell for over 2 years," he continued. "Not the family lawyer. Someone I trust completely, an old friend from West Point who now specializes in estate battles. Together, we've restructured everything." He pulled out thick folders, laying them across the polished wood like maps before a campaign. The house, our beautiful Victorian with its wide porches and century-old oaks, was now held in joint tenancy with right of survivorship. The moment Daniel passed, ownership would transfer to me, automatically bypassing probate entirely. The veterinary clinic his grandfather had built, the investment accounts we had carefully grown, even the small waterfront lot on the Potomac, they were all protected. "But that's not all," he said, a faint smile touching his lips for the first time in weeks. He slid another document toward me. "The service members' group life insurance policy. $1.2 million. Sole beneficiary Lieutenant Colonel Elena Hayes." Tears burned behind my eyes, but I held them back. Daniel had been planning this while I was still believing we might beat the cancer. He had been building a fortress in silence while I held his hand through nights of pain. Then he placed his hand gently on my abdomen. Even though I was barely showing, the gesture felt sacred. "You're 8 weeks pregnant, Elena. I had the blood work done privately during one of my appointments. The baby is healthy. Strong. Just like you." The room seemed to tilt. Joy crashed against grief so violently I couldn't speak. Daniel pulled me onto his lap, wrapping his thinning arms around me as if he could shield both me and our unborn child from the world. "I didn't tell my parents," he whispered into my hair. "They don't deserve to know yet. This child is ours, yours and mine, not theirs to claim or control." That night, he wrote the letter. Not a cold legal document, but a deeply personal message addressed to his family. I watched him write it at the same kitchen table, his hand trembling slightly as the pen moved across the heavy stationery. He documented everything, the subtle insults over 9 years, the way they had diminished my service, my background, my love for their son. Each word was measured, precise and devastating in its honesty. When he finished, he sealed the envelope and handed it to me. "Thomas has the original and clear instructions. If they make any hostile move, changing locks, throwing out your things, trying to contest anything, he is to read this aloud in their presence. Every word." Daniel looked at me, then his eyes bright with fever and love. "I'm sorry I'm leaving you with this fight, my soldier. But I know you. You won't break. You'll hold the line for our child." In the final weeks, as Daniel grew weaker and the house filled with the scent of medications and fading flowers, we spoke often of the future. He wanted our child to know the father who had loved his mother fiercely. He wanted me to continue the work we had started together, supporting military families, honoring service, building something lasting. Even as his voice faded to a whisper, his vision remained clear. The morning he slipped away peacefully in the hospital, I sat beside him, holding his hand until the monitors went silent. The grief was a living thing inside me, heavy and raw, but beneath it burned a quiet resolve. Daniel had not left me defenseless. He had armed me with truth, with legal protection, and with the most precious gift of all, our child, growing steadily within me. Now, standing in the middle of the living room they had torn apart, I felt the weight of his preparation like armor beneath my uniform. The movers had paused, sensing the shift in the air. Richard's face had gone from arrogant certainty to something closer to shock. Margaret's perfectly manicured hand trembled as she clutched the back of the sofa. They had spent years treating me like an outsider who could be removed at any time. Daniel had spent those same years making sure I could never be erased. I rested my hand lightly over the small curve of my stomach, feeling the faint, reassuring flutter that had become my secret strength. The battle they thought they had already won was only just beginning. The tension in the room thickened like the humid Virginia air before a summer storm. The movers had stopped completely, their hands still gripping boxes of my belongings. Richard's face had drained of its usual commanding color while Margaret clutched the back of the antique sofa as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Derek stood frozen near the doorway, the protein bar forgotten in his hand. Just then, the low, authoritative rumble of a powerful engine cut through the silence outside. A sleek black Mercedes S-Class glided to a stop behind the U-Haul, boxing it in. The driver's door opened and Thomas Blackwell stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. He carried a thick leather briefcase and moved with the calm precision of a man who had spent decades navigating courtrooms and military boardrooms alike. He had been Daniel's friend since West Point, and today, he was my reinforcement. Thomas walked straight up the brick pathway without hesitation, his polished shoes clicking sharply. He didn't look at me first. His focus was entirely on the Whitakers. "Richard Whitaker," he said, his deep baritone carrying easily through the open door. "You are currently engaged in illegal trespassing and the removal of property belonging to Lieutenant Colonel Elena Hayes. I suggest you instruct your men to stop immediately and return every item to its proper place." Richard straightened, trying to reclaim his authority. "This is a private family matter, Blackwell. You have no right." "On the contrary," Thomas interrupted smoothly, stepping into the living room as if he owned it. "This became a legal matter the moment you changed the locks on your daughter-in-law's home the day after her husband's funeral." He placed his briefcase on the mahogany dining table, the same table where I had once been judged, and opened it with 2 decisive snaps. He began laying out documents one by one, each page landing with quiet finality. "Joint tenancy with right of survivorship," he stated, sliding the deed across the table. "The house, the clinic, the investment accounts, all transferred automatically to Elena II. Daniel passed. No will, no probate. No discussion." Margaret made a small, choked sound. Derek's face had gone pale. Thomas continued, unflinching. "Additionally, the service members' group life insurance policy, $1.2 million, is payable solely to Lieutenant Colonel Elena Hayes. Daniel updated it 6 months ago. It is ironclad." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Then he reached into the briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. The paper was heavy cream-colored with Daniel's familiar handwriting across the front. Finally, Thomas said, his voice dropping slightly, "There is this. Daniel left explicit instructions that if any member of this family made a hostile move against his wife, I was to read this letter aloud in their presence." He adjusted his reading glasses, broke the seal, and began in a clear, solemn voice that filled every corner of the room. "To my family. If you are hearing these words, it means you have chosen blood over decency. You have chosen pride over compassion. You have chosen to strike at the woman I loved more than life itself while she was still standing at my grave. For 9 years you looked at Elena and saw only what she lacked: a Southern name, old money, the right accent. You never saw her courage. You never saw the nights she spent in war zones so that others could sleep safely. You never saw the way she loved me through every deployment, every hardship, every silent fear. You treated her service like an inconvenience, her background like something to be endured, her place in this family like a temporary assignment. You were wrong. I watched every subtle cut, every condescending remark, every attempt to diminish the woman who stood beside me with more honor than any of you have ever shown, and I chose her. Completely, irrevocably. Therefore, I have removed you from every inheritance, every future claim, every piece of the life we built. The only thing I leave you is this truth. You lost a son the day you disrespected his wife. Elena is carrying our child, your grandchild. A child you will never know unless you spend the rest of your lives earning the forgiveness you do not deserve. Now get out of her house. And may God forgive you, because I no longer can." Thomas's voice faded into absolute silence. Richard sank heavily into a dining chair, his shoulders collapsing as if the weight of his own arrogance had finally crushed him. Margaret's perfect composure shattered completely. Tears carved tracks through her carefully applied makeup. Derek looked like a man who had just watched his entire future evaporate. I stood quietly near the fireplace, one hand resting protectively over my stomach, feeling the faint, steady movement of our child. For the first time that morning, I allowed myself to breathe deeply. The scent of cigar smoke still lingered, but it no longer felt oppressive. It smelled like defeat. Thomas turned to the movers. "Gentlemen, please return every item to its original position. Now." The men moved quickly, almost gratefully, carrying the rocking chair back inside, rehanging my citations on the wall, placing the wedding photo, both of us this time, back on the mantel. The house slowly began to look like home again. Richard finally found his voice weak and broken. This isn't right." "Daniel wouldn't?" "He did," Thomas said simply. "And he knew exactly who you were. He prepared for this moment for years." I stepped forward, then my voice calm and measured. "You have 30 days to clear out the guest house. After that, the property will be managed through my attorney. Any further contact will go through him as well." Margaret looked at me, her eyes desperate. "Elena, please. For Daniel's sake." I met her gaze steadily. "Daniel already spoke. I have nothing more to add." As the movers finished restoring the room, Thomas gave me a small, respectful nod, the kind shared between soldiers who have just completed a difficult mission. The Whitakers gathered their things in stunned silence and left through the same door they had used to try to throw me out. I stood alone in the restored living room, the afternoon light filtering through the windows, warming the wooden floors Daniel and I had chosen together. My hand rested on my stomach, and for the first time since the funeral, I whispered to our child, "Your father kept his promise. We're going to be okay." 6 months later, on a crisp spring morning in Northern Virginia, I gave birth to a healthy baby boy. We named him Daniel James Hayes. He entered the world with his father's calm gray eyes and a strong cry that filled the delivery room like a declaration of victory. As I held him against my chest, feeling the warmth of his tiny body and the steady beat of his heart, the last pieces of grief and triumph settled into something quieter: peace. The old Victorian house, once a battlefield, had become a home again. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows onto the freshly polished floors. My grandmother's oak rocking chair sat by the fireplace where it belonged, and on the mantelpiece rested Daniel's final letter, framed now, a silent witness to the love that had protected us. The walls still held our photos, me and Daniel in uniform laughing during a rare leave in Germany, standing proudly at my promotion ceremony. The house smelled of fresh coffee baby powder and the faint magnolia blooming outside, the sense of life moving forward. The Whitakers tried one last time. A thick cream-colored envelope arrived 2 weeks after Daniel's birth. Inside was a stiffly worded letter from Richard, filled with excuses about grief and protecting the family legacy, along with a cashier's check for $50,000 for our grandson. I stared at it for a long moment, then walked to the kitchen sink. With a steady hand, I struck a match and watched the check curl and blacken in the flame. The ashes went into the envelope, which I sealed and mailed back without a single word. Some bridges are not meant to be rebuilt. I used part of the insurance money, the $1.2 million that Daniel had fought so hard to secure for us, to establish the Daniel Whitaker Memorial Family Fund. It provides educational scholarships, counseling services, and emergency support for the children and widows of fallen or terminally ill service members. Military families now gather in our home once a month. We sit in the living room that was almost taken from me, sharing stories, offering comfort, and reminding each other that real family is forged in loyalty, not just blood. On quiet evenings, I sit in the rocking chair with little Daniel in my arms and tell him about his father. I speak of the gentle signals officer who could decode the most complex transmissions, but whose greatest skill was loving me completely. I tell him how his father built an invisible fortress around us with nothing but foresight and unwavering love. Sometimes I catch myself smiling through tears, realizing that Daniel's true legacy was never the house or the money, it was the strength he left in me, and the life we continue to build. The scandal spread quietly through Virginia's old circles. Richard stopped attending his country club mornings. Margaret resigned from her charity boards. Derek's plans for the veterinary clinic dissolved when the staff and clients learned what had happened. They had lost far more than property. They had lost their reputation, their standing, and most painfully, any claim to their son's memory. I did not rejoice in their fall. I simply closed the door on that chapter and turned toward the future. These days, I still wear the uniform. I return to duty with a new sense of purpose, knowing that every mission I complete is also for the son who will grow up understanding what honor truly means. On weekends, the house fills with laughter, military spouses trading stories over coffee, children playing in the garden Daniel and I planted years ago. The rocking chair creaks gently as I nurse Daniel, and in those peaceful moments I feel his father's presence strongest of all. To those of you listening who have ever stood in your own home feeling like a stranger, to the widows who carry both unbearable grief and unexpected new life, to the parents who watch their children choose love over tradition, to anyone who has had to hold the line when everything seemed lost, you are not alone. Real family is not always defined by blood. Sometimes it is the person who stands beside you in the fire. Sometimes it is the quiet promise kept long after someone is gone. Hold the line with dignity. Protect what matters. And when the battle ends, use the ground you defended to build something beautiful for yourself, for your children, and for those who will come after. Thank you for walking this journey with me. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own battles, or gave you strength for the ones still ahead, I would be honored if you shared it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're listening from today. Perhaps a quiet kitchen in Texas, a car on a long drive through the Midwest, or a porch in the South, just like mine. Let's remind each other that resilience and love still matter. We have many more true stories of courage, justice, and quiet strength to share with you. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss when a new one arrives. Together we can keep honoring the bonds that no one can break. This is Lieutenant Colonel Elena Hayes, signing off.